This is Kyle Payne doing my vlog about the story titled "The Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted." And before I start my response to it, I suppose I think I should just mention that I do have a slight negative bias toward Malcolm Gladwell's work previously, just because I did try reading one of his books and was very much enjoying it until I did some research and found that not everything he always says is presented in the appropriate light, perhaps. So with that said, so I did come in with a little bit of skepticism. Uh, Regarding the article, I found that while it raises some very good, valid points that uh, social media does not actually do the the revolt itself. They do not actually change necessarily the structures that people are trying to overthrow. It does not physically get the job done. There still has to be some action taken by people that social media cannot provide. That social media cannot fill in for that physical um, action that takes place during these revolutions. I agree with that. Um, what I struggled with was some of his complaints about social media and how it was almost taking away from revolutions. And in my stance and where I struggled or disagreed with Malcolm Gladwell in his piece was that talking about the spreading of information, and where I feel that he might have missed the point when people are saying social media is impacting and changing how we are going to impact the world and how we have revolutions. I think it is mostly through the spreading and communication of those actions that people take, not not that the social media is broadcasting the news of what is happening and making other people informed of it, which previously did not exist. And I think that's the main point, that it doesn't feel like that he's almost he's focused on a different point that isn't always being made, because I don't think many people would agree that social media is just taking the place of protests and organized meetups and rallies and plans, and that for the most part that still has to happen. I don't think anyone would really disagree that a couple tweets or a like on you know a Coney 2012 page would get things done. You do have to take the steps necessary. A couple of examples that of in his story that I struggled with. One in particular was when he was talking about the networks and how social media creates networks that have some benefits in terms of being able to spread information around, and but talking about the drawbacks about how it affects that there's not a hierarchy. And he used the bus boycotts in Montgomery or Birmingham. Um, and those back in the '60s, led by Martin Luther King Jr. That those were in those that was an example of how networks wouldn't work, when it really sounded to me, because that was an example of networks working, that there was a connection of churches that that they would connect together to help then spread the information to the individual members. To me, that sounds like, well, that's what a network is, and that's what social media is doing. It's a way to connect different groups that otherwise wouldn't have that interaction, then able to plan things. So I was a little thrown off by that example. It's just something that networks are messy, and yet that to me was a perfect example of a network working well. Um, and the other thing that just really frustrated me was the lack of, as a journalism student and as someone who's written not necessarily investigative articles or research articles quite to this extent, but something similar, the lack of sourcing that he says that these four that started the sit-ins, that they were sitting in the dorms drinking beers. Like, not that I don't necessarily believe that happened, but he makes it sound like it's absolute fact without saying based on it's with it when you approach an article like this, unless if it's common knowledge that anyone would know that the sun is big and provides us warmth and energy, and that we will rotate around it. Unless it's stuff like that that's well known, sources are usually needed. So that was just kind of frustrating. And he kept on citing these like stories and anecdotes that, while they may be true, if you look at it critically, it sounds like it's fluff, and it would just be appreciated to have a source. So overall, I thought he did make some really, some valid points that social media is not a replacement for other movements and actions and activism. But I disagree that doesn't help. Then he cites the example of, oh, great, we're using it to find a sidekick. That's, what we're using social media for. And while that shows the power of it, though, and it just shows on a smaller scale. And while it may not be, the entire revolution is because of, it's not happening on Twitter. We're hearing about it, and the revolution is being broadcasted on Twitter and YouTube. And I think Ferguson's perfect case of that is that it's not that the protests were happening on Twitter, but I otherwise wouldn't have found out about what's happening except for the vines and videos that were coming through on Twitter. So that's where I struggled with the article, and I do think that the revolution will be broadcasted on Twitter because that's where we'll find out the information, not from CNN necessarily or our morning paper, but that's where we find out the information. That's how other people get involved with the case. And if they're not, if they're not motivated by social media, how they've been motivated in the first place? Uh, my little rant, I guess. So there's my vlog. I hope that covered the general basis, but thanks.